Joe Rogan is one of the most famous men on planet Earth. As the host of the most popular podcast on the market and the primary voice of the UFC's broadcast, and in this case, Joe even has managed to make some enemies of the athletes whose fights he calls on a regular basis. This is why UFC fighters hate Joe Rogan, the truth. Frank Mir. To kick things off, we're going straight back to old school with the word from the former UFC heavyweight champion Frank Mir. This legend of a heavier weight class has some of the most legendary victories in the history of the UFC, but none come more impressive than the time he became the first fighter to ever submit the insanely talented BJJ black belt Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. But what a lot of people might not know is prior to that fight, which was in fact a rematch, Mir actually became the first person to knock Nogueira out as well, finishing him with strikes in their first showdown. So where does Joe Rogan fit into all of this? Well, after his first fight with Mir, Nogueira returned to the octagon in hopes of recapturing his momentum, and during the commentary for that fight, Joe alluded to the fact that Big Nog had suffered a staph infection that led up to his loss to Mir. Now, in Frank Mir's opinion, this is almost a form of an excuse making on the part of Rogan, and he criticized the commentator for trying to force a narrative that was a bit softer on the Brazilian. In his own words, all fighters are fighting from some form of injuries or illnesses that led to fights, some minor, some major. And for Joe to come out and say that, according to Mir, put a downer on what was a huge win. Thankfully, his incredible Kimura submission on the Big Nog in the rematch saw him stamp down his authority on their rivalry.
I actually didn't get to watch him firsthand too much. I was getting a little bit of artwork done on my back, so I got him DVR'd so I could go home and watch him. I got some texts, so obviously don't want to say too much. The only thing that kind of upset me was I heard that Rogan was making a lot of excuses for certain fighters for why they perform badly. That's always disheartening to me, just for the reason being that every fighter has reasons why we don't perform at 100%. I think as fans, we don't want to hear heroes or warriors ever sitting and complaining that they almost died from staph or anything else. I think that's pretty sad and pathetic.
Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson isn't exactly the hardest person in the world to piss off. In fact, as his UFC career has progressed, this lightweight legend has more of a habit of being more and more unapologetic as his general attitude towards the media and the fans. Knowing that he is a major fan favorite who is loved by many for his unfiltered approach to the fight game, Al Kakoi these days is completely fearless when it comes to taking aim at doubters and haters. And while the vast majority of those turned in for a showdown with the current lightweight champion Charles Oliveira would agree that Do Bronx well and truly dominated from the start to finish. According to Ferguson himself, it was not that simple. Speaking to Ariel Helwani during an episode of the MMA Hour, Tony explained how Joe Rogan and Daniel Cormier played a huge part in setting the narrative that came out of the fight. According to El Kakoi, he prefers to watch the fights without sound in order to avoid the bias of the commentary team. In his own words, the guys in the broadcast booth gang up on the fighters they don't like, painting a picture of the fight that works against them. To add to this, Ferguson also said that while he was interested in making an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience at one point in time, he's not anymore. He also used this opportunity to throw shade at Daniel Cormier, who is, of course, the teammate of his longtime rival Khabib Nurmagomedov.
If you look at the commentary, if you watch my Oliveira fight without the commentary, you can actually see the fights better. I recommend anybody to do that, because what ends up happening is the commentary gang up on people that they don't like. Like I said, I never did a Joe Rogan interview before. I might, but because of that, obviously, you probably got bent out of shape on that one. And obviously when Cormier, when Khabib, and, I make my comments about fathead and not making weight. It must be a team thing, man. Those guys shit on scales. I don't understand it.
Ronda Rousey. Media appearances where MMA was discussed were few and far between as far as Ronda Rousey was concerned as soon as her winning streak came to an end in a truly shocking fashion at UFC 193. In the wake of her head kick knockout defeat of Holly Holm, Ronda pretty much shut herself off for the media, refusing to take any questions that related to her very noticeable decline. In fact, when she did make her return to the cage, Rousey insisted that she get a total exemption from media duties, something that had never been done before. Conor McGregor, in all of his superstardom, had demanded the exact same thing just a few months before and pulled out of the UFC 200 and falsely retired because he didn't get his way. But Rousey, who was always a favorite of Dana White, got her media exemption in the end. During this time, Joe Rogan was forced to admit that he had overhyped Ronda and basically said that fighting wasn't about how famous you are or how many appearances on the hit TV show Entourage you had made. Well, if you needed any proof that Rousey heard these comments and did not appreciate them one bit, the way she stormed off the stage without letting Joe interview her at UFC 207 pre-fight stare-downs tells you all you need to know. Tyron Woodley. Is Tyron Woodley the most likable character in the world? Well, it depends. Sure, he's a pretty underrated fighter and champion, but over the years, his tendency to constantly complain saw him lose a lot of the good faith the fans had in him prior to his pretty forgettable fights with Stephen Thompson and Damian Maia. And after Israel Adesanya's incredibly slow performance against Yoel Romero, Woodley couldn't help but chime in with accusations of bias on the part of the UFC commentary team. Joe Rogan was the one who came under fire, with Woodley saying that he found it odd no one had mentioned anything about the last stylebender just breaking the record for least amount of strikes thrown in a title fight, a record that Tyron himself once held. Most people are pretty quick to take shots at Woodley because they find him annoying, but to his credit, it does seem unlikely that the UFC would be as happy to see a popular star like Adesanya thrown into some category as a more divisive one like Woodley. This weekend, Aljamain Sterling looks to defend his title as fan favorite Henry Cejudo tries to strip it from him. The fighters are getting ready for Saturday's main event, and to celebrate the title fight, today's video sponsor DraftKings is bringing all the high-stakes action to any new customers. DraftKings is offering all new customers $150 in bonus bets if their pre-fight moneyline wager of $5 cashes. That's right, all new customers that bet just $5 on any pre-fight moneyline wager will receive $150 in bonus bets if their bet hits. If you're wondering what you can use your bonus bets on, try out DraftKings UFC Same Fight Parlays, where you can combine multiple bets from the same fight into one big bet for a shot at an even bigger payout. If mobile sports betting isn't available in your state yet, you can still get in on the fun with DraftKings Daily Fantasy, where they offer cash prize contests for nearly every sport. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use promo code WATCHMMA, bet $5 on any pre-fight moneyline wager, and get $150 in bonus bets if your bet hits. That's promo code WATCHMMA only at DraftKings Sportsbook. Remember, if you're enjoying our content and want to see more, be sure to leave a like before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on any of our weekly uploads. Chael Sonnen. It could sometimes be difficult to tell whether Chael Sonnen actually has beef with someone or if he's simply playing the whole thing up for the cameras. When it comes to generating controversy and stealing headlines, no one, and we repeat, no one, does it better than Chael P. Sonnen. So when the bad guy went on the offensive against Rogan after the commentator seemingly pulled the curtain back on Colby Covington's act, telling the world it's not real, Sonnen acted like it was the most shocking thing that he had ever heard. Criticizing Rogan for outing Colby even though the whole world was in on it, Sonnen was far from impressed. Joe, in return, seemed a bit baffled by the whole thing, making it clear that he had no idea whether Chael was fully serious or not. All in all, this whole beef settled down just as quickly as it began, and as far as we know, these two MMA icons are back on decent terms.
Chael does?
No, that I talked about what Colby does. I go, he's having fun. I go, he's playing up the role of the villain, and he's selling pay-per-views.
And why is he mad at you? Because you're taking away the fourth wall?
I'm giving up the secrets of the business. It's so ridiculous. Meanwhile, he's giving up the secrets of the business by talking about me giving up the secrets of the business. It's the dumbest shit of all time.
Chris Cyborg. If there's anyone on this list who has a good reason to hate Joe Rogan, it's the legendary featherweight Chris Cyborg. And while we all know the story of Rogan, Dana White, and the comedian Tony Hinchcliffe making fun of Cyborg live on air, the very direct steroid insinuation made by Rogan during an episode of his podcast were too heavy to ignore. Joe basically pulled up a clip of Cyborg powerlifting and spoke about her relationship with the comparatively huge Gabby Garcia. When the clip was over, Joe spoke about how Cyborg had tagged Garcia before, joking that the two shared the same doctor. It wasn't the first time Rogan had taken shots at the Brazilian, and it wouldn't be the last. She would later refer to Rogan as a bully. And by the way, the featherweight legend eventually left the UFC. It was clear that things weren't exactly on good terms. Out of all the fighters who have held championship belts in the UFC, the history books will show that Chris Cyborg was subjected to a truly unusual amount of abuse from those under the UFC banner. And by these days, it appears as though she's a lot happier fighting in Bellator.
They
It's time to get
tested her because she passed on 3 world title fights. They had 3 world title fights lined up for her. At 145, which is the weight class that she asked for, she said she couldn't make it in 8 weeks, and so then they gave her more weeks, and they gave her a third test, and they're like, something's up. And whether or not they were going to test her anyway, who knows? But that's when they tested her, and that's when she pissed hot.
It makes sense.
And she did not reveal before that that she was taking that.
Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib might get nothing but major praise from Joe Rogan these days, but on the night that he first touched UFC Gold, his UFC 223 clash with Al Iaquinta, something quite strange happened. The Eagle was at his dominant best against the short-notice replacement opponent in front of him. He was so comfortable, in fact, that he seemed to take some time off to show his newly perfected jab mid-fight. But when all was said and done, the fans started to notice that Joe Rogan was insanely dismissive to some of the big moments from Nurmagomedov, instead highlighting totally insignificant shots from Iaquinta instead. Call it getting caught up in the moment if you want, but it was clear that Joe wasn't doing his job correctly. He would later put out a statement apologizing to Khabib and explain just how difficult it can be to keep a level head in the middle of a title fight, but all in all, you could understand if Khabib was angry about his major UFC moment being undersold like this. The fight, if you watch it without paying any heed to the commentary, was just about as one-sided as any fight in Khabib's catalog. And though Iaquinta did well and survived, it showed himself to be as tough as ever. It shouldn't have been a big talking point, that's for sure. Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor is far from the only fighter to call out Joe Rogan for bias in his work from the commentary desk, and following his instant classic UFC 202 rematch with Nate Diaz, there were more than a few McGregor fans who thought that Joe, in particular, was getting too far excited about relatively uneventful flurries from Nate Diaz. And though Conor himself was pretty quiet on this subject, for the most part a few years later, he would speak up saying that he wished that Joe would call the fight more naturally, instead of calling it a script. Rogan, in response, seemed pretty confused by this, taking it as an accusation of him reading from a literal script. It did go on to say that UFC fighters in general hate listening to commentary of their own fights, but if we had to guess, we'd imagine that if Conor was actually watching, he'd see this as a bit of a deflection.
But what did he say? Something like, I talk
off script, talk on script, or maybe call fights on a script.
That is not really true because no one ever gives me a script. That's a fact. So, I mean, I don't know what exactly he said, but maybe he just didn't like my commentary. I bet he likes it when he wins.
And that'll just about do it for this video, but how did you feel about Joe Rogan and his continuing position as one of the most prominent voices in the UFC? Do let us know in the comment section below. Again, if you enjoyed today's video and want to see more, be sure to leave a like before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thank you for watching.
What's up, everyone?